Welcome. Hello, everyone. Nice to see you again. Thanks for joining this week. I enjoyed very much my first ever live stream a couple of weeks ago, in which I talked about my favorite Beatles albums of all time. And so I put out a poll to my audience, and the overwhelming response was to do a list of the Beatles' worst songs. Um, I don't know if that's just because people tend to like negative things over positive things. I don't know, but I think it's a really interesting list, and it was not easy to make. And I have to caveat this, of course, by saying that as a fan, it's hard to call these truly terrible songs. Even the Beatles' worst stuff is probably material that most bands would love to have produced during their careers. So, again, even for the worst Beatles songs, these aren't like horrible songs. But I do think that a lot of these songs, if they were recorded by other groups, would probably be mostly forgotten or considered just really subpar. But for the Beatles, a lot of them still remain as part of their canon as just being quirky or controversial. And I'm going to go through a list, and I'm also going to talk about some songs that a lot of people don't like that I like, or that I think deserve a little more credit than they're given generally. So I'm going to do that list at the end. So stick around. Don't want to miss that. That's probably going to be the actually most interesting part of all this. So I'm going to go through first the songs that I think belong at the bottom of the list in the Beatles canon. And, I'll have some parameters around what I think worst really means. I'll get into all that. And I'll give a little backstory behind some of these songs and some of the quirky or interesting anecdotes that went into making them, so you can hopefully learn something too, even though this is really just going to be a fun sort of ranking for everybody. So I'm going to get started now. I also want to remind you of a couple things. First, the live chat is active. I am doing my best to monitor the live chat, and I want you to please share with me your thoughts on what you think the worst songs are and what you think about my choices, because I know these are going to be controversial. I know that people are going to feel very strongly one way or another about some of these. So please let me know what you think in the comments, and then when all this is done, I'll probably run a poll anyway and get your thoughts on what you think the most and the worst, best and the worst songs are. We'll vote on them as a group. But for the purposes today, I'm going to go through my list and try to take some of the comments. So please join the live chat. It should be good. One last thing I also want to remind you is, this is a weird time, I think, for everybody. Everybody's probably working at home or has some kind of alternate situation. And I want to call attention to the fact that there's a lot of people out there who are struggling and who are going to find the next few months to be a really challenging time to get through. And one group in particular that I think is going to be hit hard are professional musicians. And last time I also did a similar effort for Music Cares, and people were like, "Oh, musicians don't need money." These aren't like Paul McCartney level musicians. We're talking about the guys who are session musicians, the people who play at your local concert halls, people who play for events, who are recording artists who are not quite as big as some of the mainstream artists. And these folks are the ones that will be most affected by cancellations, postponements, things like that. So that's who these funds go to support. For today, I'm going to push people to Spotify's COVID-19 Music Relief. They're matching up to $10 million in contributions, and there are multiple charities in different countries. So go to the link that's in the video and also be in the description below, COVID-19 Music Relief.byspotify.com, and you'll see a list of charities. Pick the ones that you feel most speak to you, or maybe are from your country. And consider donating. Any small amount, I think, will be appreciated. And musicians someday will probably really appreciate you taking the time to do that if you can. So anyway, I won't dwell on that too much, but I do want to remind people that there's a lot of people out there who are out of work, and in particular musicians, and I want to help support that because music is a part of our cultural fabric. It's extremely important, and I want to do whatever it takes to help people who are working through this time. So without further ado, let's move on to the list, and that's what everyone's really here for. What I want to start off with first is a little careful explanation of what my list consists of. And one big distinction I'm going to make today is originals versus covers. Okay, so let me get into this first thing here. A lot of people have suggested, songs that are actually covers as the Beatles' worst material. And I, in putting together my list, didn't really want to include covers as part of my worst list, and here's why. I think that the Beatles did a wide range of covers, some good, some not great, but they didn't write the songs themselves. And a lot of the songs were left over from their repertoire when they were touring as a band before they were signed as recording artists. They were playing clubs in Hamburg and Liverpool and places like that. And so they were picking songs that they liked to listen to, and they turned them into covers that were, often creative and inventive, but sometimes just sort of lackluster and unnecessary. And they weren't the only band doing this. Like a lot of bands at this time had covers as part of their material. And so I pointed out what I think are some of their worst ones, but they're not in my official list. So like things like Mr. Moonlight, which if you've heard it, it's on Beatles for Sale, which is also not one of my favorite albums because it features a lot of these sort of subpar covers. Mr. Moonlight is pretty bad. It's kind of cringeworthy. It's just not a great performance. The song is fine, but I don't think that John does a great job with his singing. It's kind of a mess. Kansas City, Hey, 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 Hey is another one. A classic song, like a songbook, really, Leiber and Stoller hit, but I don't think the Beatles do it justice. And it's also on Beatles for Sale, another album I told you I don't like very much. And Honey Don't, which is also on the same album, Beatles for Sale, which Ringo sings, and it's a Carl Perkins cover. And again, I just don't think they're great. Another example is Bad Boy, which is a Larry Williams song, which actually was so, I guess, not great. The Beatles didn't even include it on any of their albums in the UK. It was only stuck on as an afterthought to one of the US albums. I believe it was Beatles 6, which is kind of like an afterthought anyway. The Beatles weren't part of those albums. They were just sort of cobbled together by Capitol Records in the United States. So they pulled like a leftover, which was Bad Boy. Again, if you don't even recognize these names of songs, don't be surprised because most people don't even know these. The hardcore Beatles fans probably, some people love these. I mean, I've seen some comments, people, oh, Mr. Moonlight's great, it's fantastic. I guess to each his own with these, but I don't even want to include them in my ranking officially because I don't think the Beatles should be judged on songs that other people wrote. So today's list is really like what the Beatles produced and wrote themselves. What's not great from that. A little interesting fact, though, out of the Beatles' entire catalog, they had 25 covers on their released material, and that was up against 188 original songs. So it's actually a pretty high ratio, I would say, of cover songs when you think about bands today. So that's just sort of an interesting little tidbit. But some of their covers are fantastic. Like I think "Twist and Shout" is probably the definitive version of that song. I actually like how they do "Roll Over Beethoven." There's a couple others that, they're admirable covers, and you can tell why they love playing them because they probably played them live, and they were great songs live. And as I'll point out later on too, some of these songs, when the Beatles played them live, were much better than the studio versions. But I'm going to be judging the studio versions today, and I think that just in general, like the covers aren't really worth getting too in the weeds on. So. Anyway, that's what I'm going to say about covers. Let's keep moving on, though, because this is where it gets, I think, a lot more interesting. This is the originals. And I'm going to go one by one, and I put them in chronological order because I think it's easier to talk about these as from the periods they come from. So it's not really like a 1 to 10 rank. It's also really hard to rank these because they all have different little pieces of them that are better and worse than other things. So I'm just going to kind of present them in a list. Give you a general sense of the ranking, but it's going to go in chronological order, so you can hopefully make some predictions about where things are going. So, P.S. I Love You is my first official Beatles worst song, and it's kind of hard to actually say that this is a bad song because they were so young when they wrote these. Like, I mean, they were barely 20, 21, and a lot of these songs were just things that they were writing, like, in an hour between shows or something. And I don't think it's quite fair to like compare these to some of the things they were doing like 5 or 6 years later. But still, at the same time, there's a range of like quality, right? Some of the songs from the early days are fantastic. They hold up today. They're thoroughly enjoyable. And other ones, to me, I just have trouble listening to them. I kind of struggle. So P.S. I Love You is one of those. It was released, it's one of their very, very early songs, written in 1962, released in 1962, before any of their albums had even been released. So this was just released as a single, but it was the B-side to a single. And for like the kids out there who don't know what A-side, B-side is, Back in the old days of like vinyl records, you could flip it over, and like they would release singles on what was called 45 RPM, discs, and there would be an A side, which is often like the more popular song, and there was something to stick on the back because you had it back and you wouldn't want to waste it. And they would put like a less and less, I don't know, lower quality song, let's just say, on the back. Sometimes the B was actually better than the A, but generally it was like the A was the one that got to play, B was sort of an afterthought. P.S. I Love You was on the B side of Love Me Do. And Love Me Do, of course, is like the song that launched the Beatles into stardom. And P.S. I Love You is catchy, but it's not at the same level, and I don't love it. But there are some really interesting quirks about this song. Um, it's actually not Ringo playing on the woodblocks. There's no drums in the song, but it's woodblock, and Ringo's not playing on it. And the reason for that is they weren't really sure that Ringo was actually going to be the full-time drummer. They were sort of on the fence about Ringo. He had played on a couple of sessions, but George Martin and others felt he wasn't quite up to the task, or I'm not exactly sure if like Ringo felt he wasn't good enough. This was already a big group at the time in the early 60s among the sort of Liverpool scene, so maybe Ringo was a little intimidated. Regardless, Ringo doesn't play on this. Actually, I think he plays maracas, but he doesn't play the woodblock percussion, which is kind of funny because you think it's a classic early Beatles song that doesn't have Ringo playing the drums on it. It's another guy, Andy White, who they had hired as a session musician to play just for this session. So kind of funny little quirk about that song. And also George Martin wasn't present at the recording session for the version that was released. So just another sort of interesting tidbit that this is not like the full Beatles ensemble. It's almost like a predecessor to that full lineup of the five of them together, the four Beatles and George Martin. So anyway, moving on, because I think these early ones don't deserve a ton of attention. Next one is Thank You Girl. This is one that I frankly didn't really know all that much about, and I was going back through the article, or I was going back through the archive of their songs, and was like, this seems kind of like one that's overlooked a lot, and I think for good reason. Again, it's just one of these early kind of bubblegum, very boy bandish throwaway tunes that I think they were cranking out on a regular basis and just weren't really super into. It just didn't reflect the sort of creativity they would get into later on, and is forgettable because of that. So funny enough, like I said, it's a B-side to another song, so it was clearly the Beatles themselves didn't think it was good enough to be an A-side. But Paul later on actually said it was a bit of a hack song. So you kind of have to agree with the guy who wrote it that if they don't even think that highly of it, chances are not that great. So I would agree. 1963, Thank You Girl. Go listen to it. I mean, some of these are really interesting to listen to because they're of their era, and they sound a lot like other things that were coming out at the time. So they fit in with the era. They're not like weird or anything. They're just, I don't know. And on a side note, I wish I could play these for you, but YouTube is very, very strict about copyright and all this stuff. And a lot of you have asked why my regular videos aren't taken down because of copyright. Well, in fact, they are sometimes. And with every video, I usually have to dispute. So like I can't even play the songs in my regular videos very much. In a live thing, it's even harder. So unfortunately, I can't play these for you. But I would suggest if you got Spotify or something open, listen to these while I'm mentioning them, because maybe it's a song you haven't heard before. Maybe you'll actually like it. Anyway, moving on. So this starts to get into periods where I think people are more familiar with the Beatles stuff. This is another song from what I would call their early days, but it's the early to mid period when they're starting to evolve. It's getting a little bit out of that very pop sound, and they're exploring some new directions. And this song, She's a Woman, is another sort of quiet, under the radar song from this period. It's not on any of their main UK albums, I don't think. It was released in the US on an album called Beatles 65, which again was like one of these US compilation albums that the Beatles themselves didn't have anything to do with, but it was just put together to sell the Beatles in the US. So for whatever reason they picked She's a Woman. I don't know. I mean, I get what they were going for. Paul was clearly trying to get into some kind of a blues rockabilly thing. They were trying to expand their sound a little bit. There's kind of a cool syncopated rhythm going on. But the song doesn't really work for me. I don't know. It feels like it's an imitation. It, at least the studio version, lacks the energy that I would expect from like a song in that genre. and for whatever reason, they just they didn't pull it off that day. And they do. I will say though, there is an excellent live version of it on the Hollywood Bowl album, which I think is now on Spotify and stuff. And the live version kind of, it cooks. Like I think it's what they were going for. The studio version feels a little bit like they could have done more. And I don't love it. I don't go back to it very often. I think it was also on the Past Masters compilation albums, but for whatever reason, the Beatles themselves didn't think it was good enough to be on an album, so it's not on one in the U.S. So let's see what some of the comments are up to now. People saying She's a Woman is great, very good. Okay, so well, there's obviously mixed opinions about it. My number one song on Spotify. Well, it's clearly some passionate fans of the song. Um, you know, uh, yeah. I mean, this is the problem with these; they're controversial. But I just don't love this one as much as I do the others from this period. Like I Feel Fine, which is on the A side of this, is an outstanding song that pushes them in a new direction. She's a Woman just feels kind of like they're just sort of trying that blues stuff. I think they would do better later on. So anyway, moving on, I want to get out of like the early period where I think they were still finding their footing and getting into some stuff that'll be really controversial. So here we go. What Goes On? Now, some of you might think like this is off Rubber Soul. Rubber Soul is like probably one of their best albums. I think in my ranking last week or 2 weeks ago, it was in the top 5 for sure. Rubber Soul is an excellent album. Excellent. Don't get me wrong. But What Goes On, it just doesn't seem to fit. And the reason that it doesn't fit is actually the song is not from this period. It predates the Beatles, in fact. John wrote it when they were performing as the Quarrymen. And he, was influenced a lot by, I think, skiffle and these other kind of local sounds at the time, and probably wrote the song as a throwaway and sat on it for a while. Clearly, the band was going to record it. I think in 1963, they actually tried to record it at a session, but for whatever reason, it didn't come together. They sat on it for a while, and then when Rubber Soul was about to be finished, there was a rush. They wanted to get this album out in time for Christmas 1965. And there were a few spaces left for songs, and they needed to cobble some things together. One of the songs actually was I'm Looking Through You, which I did a video on, you might remember, about why it's so messy. And part of the reason of that is because they were really rushing to get to this deadline. So what they did was they pulled a song from their archive, essentially something that they felt they could record very quickly. They already had written. John had written it himself, so he was able to bring it to the group and say, let's just do it. However, he picks Ringo to sing. Always a big question mark when they're picking Ringo to sing. I felt, that with the Beatles, they were giving Ringo the kind of stuff that was a little bit of a throwaway and just to kind of give him something. And in this case, no exception. They kind of just gave him a song that was a leftover. And it's kind of unique because it's Ringo harmonizing, I think, with John. See, they're kind of both there, but it's Ringo's song when he's singing, and I just don't love it. I skip over it often on Rubber Soul Listen, and it just kind of mars an otherwise perfect album, in my opinion. So yeah, see, even some people are saying, "What goes on?" I can't even remember how it goes. Yeah, it's about how forgettable it is. At least you can forget it. It just, I don't know. I don't like how he sings on it. What else are people saying about it? I wouldn't say the song is bad. I'm Looking Through You is the best song on Rubber Soul. Yes. There's a lot of great songs on Rubber Soul. This just is not one of them, folks. What else about this song? There's really nothing else to say about it. Let's move on a little bit further here. Okay. Now we're getting into some real heated territory. So we're in middle period Beatles now. This is what a lot of people, I think, would call their peak creative moment. Sgt. Pepper's is an outstanding album. It's a masterpiece of creativity, not just from the songs themselves, but like the way it's packaged and the way they flow together. The art, the pop art, the design of it, everything. Really, really, they spent a lot of time on this album. It shows. And overall, as an album, it's excellent. But I don't love this song on this album, With a Little Help from My Friends. Another Ringo sung song, folks. It just, to me, does not have the same strength as some of the other songs they were writing in this period. And I'm seeing people are flipping out over this. I expected this sort of controversial reaction. This guy's calling the police. Okay, well, what are we going to do? It's controversy. The reason I don't love the song, though, and I'm going to clarify in a minute, it's the performance of it I don't love. I think the way that Ringo sings it and the way that the band treats it is just a little bit, I don't know, it's a little bit corny, it's a little bit, the sentimentality is over the top, and it just detracts from what's an excellent album overall. I mean, it's the second song in the album, like they stuck it so early on. I can usually get through it. It's not like unbearable, but to put a song like that in an album that has stuff like A Day in the Life and She's Leaving Home or Within You Without You, like these songs that are really really profound and just well written songs. This one feels kind of eh. I will say though, I do love Joe Cocker's cover version of this song. I think it takes it to a whole other level. And if you've ever seen the film Woodstock or heard his version of it somewhere, it's almost unbelievable that they're the same song. The way he transforms it, and so I think then it's really not that the song itself is fundamentally flawed. I think it's a well written song. I think it's really interesting and layered, but the performance of it does not do it for me. So sorry, folks. I mean, it's gonna be a lot of really pissed off people clearly in the comments, where people saying, "I don't like Ringo much, do you?" I don't admit it. I don't like Ringo. I mean, I like Ringo. He's a great drummer. I just think a lot of his songs end up on people's worst lists for a reason. And it's just, frankly, because I think the other Beatles didn't really want to give him their best stuff. And maybe that's unfortunate. Later on, I think he did some other songs that I really like. I like his cover of I Want to Be Your Man. We'll get to another one later I won't even mention now that's controversial, but I like some of his other stuff, but I just feel in general he got sort of the leftover stuff from the Beatle catalog to sing, and so it's unfortunate. But there is a funny story though about this song. There was a line in it originally where Ringo's singing, "What would you do if I sang out of tune? Would you step up and throw tomatoes at me?" And apparently he did not want that line to go in the song because he was concerned that people would actually throw tomatoes at him when he sang the song live. And considering I think he sings the song at every concert Ringo ever does, probably wise that they changed the line would you stand up and walk out of me? It's a little less, I don't know, a little less physical. So, okay, what else are people saying about this? There's not a bad moment on Sergeant Pepper. No, there's some good songs on it. Good Morning is terrible. No, I completely disagree. I love Good Morning, Good Morning. I think that is a genius composition, and I mean, awesome. So I'm not going to comment on that one. What else? This is fun. I love Ringo's singing. Ringo's great. WTF. Okay, well, here we go. You've lost your right to add any more Ringo songs to the list. I got some bad news coming up for you, but anyway, I'll defend Ringo at the end. Don't worry, it's not all bad. I'm going to move on though because this one's clearly causing a ton of controversy. But I think there are some people out there who probably agree that if you had to pick, this is not the best song off Sgt. Pepper's, and the fact that there is a really good cover version out there, I'd rather just say that it's a well-written song, performance meh. Moving on. All right. Here we go. Now we're getting into post Sgt. Pepper's, and this is, I think, a period where the Beatles were struggling creatively, and to no surprise, there's just sort of a dip in originality, I guess you could say, or just a dip in the quality overall. A lot of it feels like a retreading of what they had already done with Sgt. Pepper's, or it feels sort of like a part two. And Magical Mystery Tour is the project that came up in the wake of Sgt. Pepper, and was actually kind of the beginning of the end for the Beatles. And this is well cited in Beatles history that this is the moment where Paul starts to take creative control, and it becomes a little too far in sort of the mix between psychedelic and like old-timey stuff, and the other band members kind of felt marginalized. And so I think for people who love Paul McCartney songs, this period is amazing, right? They love this stuff. And don't get me wrong, these songs are not bad, but they don't do it for me, and they don't accomplish at the same level what Sgt. Pepper's does, or on the other side, what White Album does. And I think that that dip during the Magical Mystery Tour period is simply because the dynamics of the band were breaking down, and that John and others, they weren't able to balance out some of Paul's instincts with these things. Now, Blue Jay Way, you'll say, oh wait, that's not a Paul song, that's a George Harrison song, and you'd be correct. But I think overall, just in this period, they're leaning too much into the experimental direction that they went with Sgt. Pepper's, and they didn't really surpass what they were doing with some of these songs. Now, some of their other stuff in this period is fantastic. Don't get me wrong, like Strawberry Fields Forever, which was actually pre-Pepper, but it came out after. But Strawberry Fields Forever is excellent. Penny Lane, fantastic. Baby You're a Rich Man. Hell, Hey Bulldog is one of their best. It's also in this period. But then there's also these things on the bottom, and I don't know. Blue Jay Way is one of them. Blue Jay Way is a song you probably, unless you're a Beatles fan, you probably can't recall it off of just by name. You have to listen to it to remember what it was. It's basically George Harrison telling the story of when he went to visit a friend in Hollywood, in the Hollywood Hills, in LA. And it's like kind of a literal reading of that trip. It's like he's driving along and then this and that. So again, it's just sort of like he probably penned it after just doing this drive and thought, oh, this would be clever. And then the rest of the band probably didn't really pay much attention to it. And so George wasn't challenged enough to kind of finish it in a meaningful way. Now, there's some cool things about the song too. I like some of the effects used on the organ and the vocals, and there's that cool cello, and Ringo's drumming's pretty good. But it does feel kind of like a knockoff of the ideas that they were already doing. Like Strawberry Fields Forever feels like it's a much better version of this, but that came before it. So it's a little derivative, it's a little bit of a throwaway. And I think it's not surprising that it's on Magical Mystery Tour, which for a lot of people feels like their weakest album or close to that, because it is kind of like Sgt. Pepper's Part 2. It was an EP, not an LP. Anyway, so what are people saying about this? I will fight anyone who says Hey Bulldog is bad. Well, I agree. Hey Bulldog is awesome. And, it's fantastic. Like, they were doing great stuff in this period too, but there were some weak links, and Blue Jay Way is one of those. Anyone notice he skipped Good Day Sunshine, Dr. Robert? I skipped those because they're both fantastic songs, and nothing on Revolver is less than amazing. So I will fight that to the end. I think everything on Revolver is utterly genius. So let's see, what other ones? Mr. Moonlight's kind of cheesy. Yeah, that was on my early covers list of things I don't like. What else we got going on? Yeah, so Blue Jay Way. Let's move on because I don't really love the song. I don't want to dwell on it too much, but it just feels kind of like an George Harrison experimental song that didn't really go anywhere. It wasn't kind of finished. Unfortunately, we've got to stay on Magical Mystery Tour because this album is kind of bipolar. Like there's an awesome side to this album, and that's like the Strawberry Fields Forever, Hello Goodbye, Penny Lane, All You Need Is Love, Baby You're a Rich Man. There's that fantastic stuff, but it's dragged down by this stuff that's like filler. There's just no other word for it. Flying is an instrumental track. It's not even, there's no lyrics on it, I don't think. Like there's some singing, but there's no lyrics. It's the band basically wrote it to fill time in the Magical Mystery Tour film. And it works as kind of an interlude, but it's not a song that you would like come back to and listen to often. I don't know, it just doesn't feel like something the Beatles were really proud of making. It's on my list because I just don't think it holds up in the same way like the rest of the Beatles' original catalog does. So, had they done an album of just like instrumentals or something, then maybe this would have been something cool for them to do. But in this case, it feels like an afterthought. Everyone says Flying. I would agree. It's weird. I've never even heard of this song. Well, yeah, that's part of the problem with some of these too. These just aren't popular songs because people don't want to like listen to these very often. One interesting about this song, though, it's the first song to credit all four Beatles. So it's actually listed. You might know that most of the Beatles songs were Lennon-McCartney. They were credited Lennon-McCartney. Even if it was written by Lennon or McCartney, they would credit them. They would credit both of them. That was just the way that they established the rights. Some were Harrison songs, obviously, if George wrote them. And then Ringo has like one, I think, to his name alone, which we'll come to. But this was the first one that has all four Beatles on it. So, they all kind of lent a hand to one of their worst songs. So go figure. I don't know what you want to make of that. But what are the people saying? Blue Jay Way is better than the Abbey Road medley. That's a hot take. I can't agree with that one. Um, I personally love Flying. Just hearing all the Beatles harmonize. Knuckle Chuckle saying, yeah. I mean, look, there's elements to every Beatles song that have those magical qualities that makes them a great band. Their harmonies, the instrumentation, the production value. There's stuff about all these that I find interesting, but um, this one just doesn't do it for me as a top song. It's just not in my rotation. So um, this guy goes, just a 12-bar blues throwaway. It might be just be a jam that was orchestrated. Yeah, I think that's basically what it was. They were just writing filler, and they had some orchestration laid on top of it. So I won't spend too long on this one. Moving on. Unfortunately, we cannot get out of Magical Mystery Tour land. This is pretty brutal that there's 3 songs on my list from this album, and I kind of tried to not dwell too much on it as being that bad, but it really is. Your mother should know this is going to be really this is going to be controversial for some people. Some people absolutely love this song. I will say it's catchy, but not catchy in a great way. It's a very just Paul McCartney song. It's trademark McCartney, old sentimentality, kind of like throwback um, sound, and it's a production. And it's catchy, but I don't love it. I just don't love it as a Beatles song. To me, it doesn't strike me as a real quintessential Beatles song, and so for that reason, I'll listen to it very often. The other problem with this song is it has like a good beginning and has an idea that never really builds to anything. There's never really, it just feels kind of unfinished. Like the idea started off as something and they never really were able to put it in a place that they loved as a group. And so it just feels like Paul wrote it, slapped it together, and works in the movie and stuff, but it's not a great song. Um, so let's see. What are people saying about it? I personally love this song. Time to Fight. Your Mother Should Know are amazing. It's one of my favorite songs. Yeah, I can see that. I'm not gonna like fight someone to the death over this song, but it's not one that I come to very often, and it fits the movie more than I think it fits like the overall Beatles canon of stuff. So um, anyway, some interesting things about it though. It was actually considered for that TV One World TV special that the Beatles did. The one where they're actually singing "All You Need Is Love." It's like the first satellite broadcast in the world where everybody was linked up, and the Beatles are like performing in front of a live audience and all that stuff. Um, and it's weird to imagine that they would do anything except "All You Need Is Love." Like I can't imagine them doing "Your Mother Should Know" live on that program, but apparently it was considered. But John and George really didn't like this song. This was like peak Paul McCartney, and I think for them at this point in time, they were just very over that sort of Paul influence, and so this was a song that they have definitely both said that they do not like, and so you don't hear about it a lot. It's kind of forgotten in the Magical Mystery Tour period, and so these 3 songs together, Blue Jay Way, Flying, and Your Mother Should Know, to me, it comes out of that period post Sergeant Pepper's where things just sort of feel like they're losing a little bit of steam. They're kind of running on that same wave from Pepper, but they're not going up. They're kind of like sinking a little bit, which they'll come back up. But that's just the way I feel about this period. And some people love this period, and that's cool too. Like I mean, it's fine. But I so far have I don't know. In my listening experience, this is what I go to least. So anyway, moving on. Finally getting out of Magical Mystery Tour, I think. Right. Well, actually, sort of. The funny story. So the next one, All Together Now. This one's kind of has a funny backstory to it. And this, to me, like this is a kid's song, and Paul McCartney is a talented songwriter. He is arguably one of the best of all time. But some of his stuff just feels like it does not belong part of the Beatles canon, and he didn't have a place to put it. And so songs like these to me are just not on the top of the Beatles like lists for a good reason. And I think that the Beatles themselves felt this way too. I don't think like my choices are all that controversial when you consider the Beatles, or at least whoever was assembling their albums with them, were sort of saying to them, don't use these songs, they're not your best. All Together Now was actually recorded in that same period as the previous three songs, Blue Jay Way, Flying, Your Mother Should Know. It was in that post Sgt. Pepper's era. But the band actually sat on it for 2 years because they, I don't know, for whatever reason, weren't thrilled with it. It didn't fit on anything. And it wasn't released until 1969 when the Yellow Submarine movie soundtrack was released. They stuck it on there because it fit in with the film. And so, it's a great kids song. I'm sure kids love it. I'm sure there are people who love this song too, and listen to it frequently. It's not mine. It's not my favorite. It's not one that I ever listen to. It's cheesy. It's whatever. I don't need to like bash it so much, but it's clear that it just wasn't like the Beatles' greatest hit, and that wasn't one they were super proud of. Interestingly, George Martin was not involved. I think it was Jeff Emmerich or somebody was just running the session that day. George Martin did not was not there for the recording, and I think it's one of those where like had he been there, he probably would have been like, guys, this is not up to par. But at this point in the Beatles' career too, they were sort of running the show at Abbey Road or at EMI Studios, and they could do whatever they wanted. And so if they wanted to stay up all night and record a song like this, they could, and no one was really going to stop them. But it was not released until 1969, 2 years later, so that must say something about how they felt about it. So All Together Now, let's see what people are saying about it. What do we think? All Together Now, it's a little silly, but no way a bad song. Yellow Submarine's not a true album, it's just a soundtrack. That's true. It's part of the reason that it was low on my list of best albums. Yeah, it's definitely not an album that they sat down and conceived to be an album. It's just sort of leftovers and a mix of George Martin's like orchestrated stuff for the movie and these like leftover songs. So anyway, it's low on the list, and I don't think this is too controversial of a choice. Yellow Submarine 2: Adventures in Mediocrity. Oh, that's a good one. I'm gonna use that. I don't mind All Together Now, but I wouldn't go out of my way to listen to it. Yeah, that's kind of how I feel about it too. Like none of these are horrible songs, but they're not great. When you compare it to the stuff that they were producing, that's like unforgettable. This stuff is meh. All right, moving on. Sorry, Ringo fans. Really sorry, but this had to be on the list. I am an enormous fan of the White Album. It goes without saying. I will defend many songs on the White Album that other people will not touch. But I don't think Don't Pass Me By is a good song. And unfortunately, it is Ringo's actual original composition. He wrote it himself. He actually wrote it in 1962. He wrote it way, way, way before any of this stuff was happening. He wrote it at the very beginning of the Beatles. And I think that the band probably, wanted to give him something that he could feel like he had some ownership over, not just a song that they wrote for him to sing. And so this was his contribution to the White Album, or at least his original contribution to the White Album. He does sing on Good Night, which is, beautiful. But Don't Pass Me By is, in a word, grating. It's a song that actually is one of the few Beatles songs that, to me, is almost painful to listen to. Like, it's just not enjoyable. The lyrics are a little weird, too. The whole thing was like the car crash stuff. Like, that feeds into like that Paul is dead conspiracy. Like, why would you write a song with such weird stuff in it in the first place? And Ringo, of all people. It's just not a great performance. It's sort of corny. I don't love this song. Sorry, anybody who loves it. There's a lot of people who like Ringo and love his stuff, and he's got some great stuff, and he's a fantastic drummer. But man, as a songwriter, I just don't think he had the same sort of talent that his three other bandmates had. And that's kind of obvious if you look at his solo career too. Like, he used a lot of compositions that were written by other people on his solo albums. And there's nothing wrong with that. But it's just a reflection of his talent as a songwriter compared to three of the best songwriters in the history of recorded music. And when you're on that scale, yeah, it's going to be really hard to write something that is on par with what's around it. So Not a great song. I think it's, I don't know, actually, I forget which side of the White Album it's even on, but I'm pretty sure it's not in the first side or the second side. Um, so it's just sort of in there as Ringo's song. I don't love it. What are people saying? I don't love the song, but there's far worse. Um, he's trying too hard to be Buck Owens. Yeah, I think a lot of it is just like he's channeling other inspiration, but he doesn't quite do it as well as other people are doing. And Ringo loves like the sort of country western sounding things or like folksy Americana sound in a lot of his stuff, a lot of his sung compositions, and this just doesn't do it. I don't know. So anyway, I skip over it almost every time I listen to the White Album. One of the very few songs I skip over almost every time. But there's some still interesting quirks about this song, which I think I got into in my video on the White Album, mentioned it at least. There's a big difference between the mono and stereo version of this song. So you might know the White Album was the last album that was released in both mono and stereo formats. And in the 60s, they had two different formats at two different price points. And mono, of course, was the one channel, stereo was the two channel, and they were mixed differently. The Beatles often mixed them very differently because they spent a lot of time on the mono in the beginning, and then stereo was an afterthought, and then it kind of flipped. But on the White Album, for some weird reason, the mono version of this song is at a totally different speed than the stereo version, so the pitch is different. And there's also a different part of the outro that isn't on one, that's on the other. I forget which one it is. I think it's the mono has extra. But anyway, if you do have a copy of the mono White Album, you'll notice the song sounds differently than the other version. So it's just a sort of strange anecdote, strange anomaly. There are other songs that do have variations, mono versus stereo, but this is one of like the really weird ones. Like, why would they have a different speed? I mean, why isn't there enough quality control to pick the right speed? And you might ask, which one's the right one? Anyway, it was also a #1 hit in Denmark in April 1969. Go figure, I guess in Denmark, they love the way Ringo sings. So don't pass me by. It belongs, I think, on a worst list. Sorry, Ringo fans. This guy goes, I just hopped in. I already hate this list. I'm out. Well, that's the point. You're not supposed to like this list. These are songs we don't like. So, the stereo version is far better than the mono version. The mono version is very annoying because they speed his voice up. So there you go. I think that the mono, I guess, is faster and it sounds higher pitched, which is just a bit weird. So what else are people saying here? A video on Don't Pass Me By. Well, if, I don't have to listen to it that often to make a video, but I'll consider it. Really do not like this song. Let's see. Okay, yeah, I think it's enough about this one. I don't think this is that controversial. Okay, moving on. Now, I'm going to continue with the White Album. I know I said I like a lot of stuff on the White Album. There's also a few things in the White Album that are admittedly not great. I'll explain why. Wild Honey Pie. You knew it was going to be on this list. I think this is often cited as the worst released Beatles song, and for good reason. It's an experimental throwaway song. Most people probably have not heard it unless you've listened to the White Album all the way through. Now, I will say a couple things about this song. First, this is not to be confused with the song Honey Pie, which is also on the White Album and is a great song. I mean, it's sort of your typical Paul fare from this period, but why they have a song called Wild Honey Pie? It's on the same album and is just so different and terrible. I don't know why they did that. The story apparently is that the Beatles were recording this just as an experimental thing. This was after their period in India, where they had kind of escaped the pressures of stardom for a few weeks or months in some cases, and they were writing a lot of really experimental things. They were pushing things in new directions. They were trying out styles they'd never tried before, and this was just one of the ones that I think they were doing the craziest thing they could think of. It's this sort of cacophony, and it's not really a song. It's just sort of a repetition of Wild Honey Pie, or Honey Pie, Honey Pie. They just keep saying that over and over. Thankfully, it's short. It's not a very long song, so even if you get stuck in a room and you have to listen to the White Album and can't advance tracks for some reason, or you're listening to the vinyl, it goes by quickly enough, so it has that going for it. But it's a pretty terrible song. I mean, I'm curious what people say in the comments. It's just too experimental for me. It's disordered. It's mostly Paul experimenting with layering. Um, yeah. I mean, I think everybody's kind of like mostly in agreement here. It's a throwaway. Some people saying it's short and it's sweet. Um, you have to be in a certain mood. I agree. It's just not. It's just clearly they weren't intending it to be a full song. The stories, as I said, I think Patty Harrison, who was George Harrison's wife at the time, apparently she liked it, and for some reason the Beatles thought that they should include it on the album. I guess because she had said she liked it so much. So it's clear that with the White Album they weren't being as tough about the songs that they were including on it because they wanted to go in directions that people were unexpecting or they were not expecting. You get stuff like Revolution 9, which I'll talk about later. It's not on this list. There's songs that are definitely different than anything they were making. And so I think in that context, Wild Honey Pie, I can see why they said, you just stick it in. Like, we're not trying to make an album of things that people love. We're trying to make an album of things that push some boundaries that people are not expecting. So in that respect, I think it works as an album, as an element of the White Album, but as a song, man, it sucks. It's just not good. Um, Also interesting that it's Paul's song. I mean, you would kind of almost expect this to be John because it's so weird, but on the White Album, everything's sort of inverted, and Paul is actually doing the more experimental stuff in some cases, and John's actually doing some of the more sort of traditional sounding Beatles stuff. So this is actually mostly Paul contribution. All right, moving on. Let's see, we're doing okay here. In the comments, let's see, there's a Maxwell Silver. We're going to talk about a few of these later. Okay, let's keep going. So this is actually the last one on my list of worst Beatles songs, and I think this will be very controversial for a lot of people because we got another Harrison song, For You Blue. And For You Blue is a song that's at the very end of their career. This was on Let It Be, and it was actually, was it released as a single? I'm not sure. I don't think so. I should probably have looked that up. But it's on Let It Be, and it's on the latter side of Let It Be. And, you know, it's a fine song. Like, it's just a 12-bar blues. George Harrison clearly loved that stuff. I could see him, like, jamming with Eric Clapton to this kind of thing. But it's not a great song. Like, it's just sort of average. Like, it's mediocre. It's not, it doesn't rise, I think, above just a standard blues jam that they're playing in the studio. And so I don't love it. I won't skip over it. Like, it's fine. It's perfectly fine on Let It Be. But it's not. It's definitely my least favorite song on Let It Be, and it's just not a. It's not a Beatles song that I would consider in their top tier at all. And anyway, and I would say to people who have seen the list, there's more coming. So just stick around. This is, yeah, whatever it says. Love all of George's songs except Let It Be for some reason. Let It Be songs. So he did For You Blue, and he also wrote I Me Mine on Let It Be, which also is not great, but at least it's kind of interesting. So I wouldn't put it on a worse list. But I think what's clear in this period is that George was checked out. He was already planning All Things Must Pass, which is his solo album that came out shortly after Let It Be. He was already, realizing like the other Beatles weren't respecting his contributions in the way he was, in the way he wanted. And frankly, he had written some incredible songs that the group just sort of still felt were second rate. And so I don't think he gave his best stuff to Let It Be. I think that's why we got stuff like For You Blue on this album. He also did Old Brown Shoe, which, strangely enough, is another like 3-word song that's essentially like a basic blues song from George at the same time. They're very, very similar, and I often get them confused, actually, and they rhyme. So it's just sort of a weird coincidence. I actually went back and forth on whether to put Old Brown Shoe on this list, because I think it's kind of in that same sort of territory of like George leftover songs. But it is actually a very catchy song, and the bass playing is awesome, and that middle 8 is cool. So I couldn't put it on a worse list, but I had to pick For You Blue because I just don't think it's that great. Some interesting quirks about it. There's no bass guitar on this track. Paul actually is playing piano, and they didn't overdub bass, so there's no bass on this song. George wrote it for his wife, Patty. There's not much else to say about it. So yeah, again, Old Brown Shoe is an underrated gem. I agreed. It's definitely underrated. I think it's not a bad song. And But For You Blue, I actually wish they had put Old Brown Shoe on Let It Be instead of For You Blue. I think that would have been a better choice, and I'm curious what people think in the comments if that would have made more sense. Because Old Brown Shoe, I think most people just aren't familiar with, because I think it was the B-side to, I forget what, not Long and Windy Road, but one of those. And so I think a lot of people just have never heard it. And it's a great song. But For You Blue, it's on the album, so it gets more attention. But not my favorite. And I think had another band recorded this, they probably would have done a better version of it. Maybe like a Creedence Clearwater Revival or something would have been cool, but it just doesn't work with the Beatles. So that's it. That's my list of the worst songs. And again, the covers aren't really on this list because I think they're sort of a separate category. I could even do a whole video just on covers. These are the originals. These are the ones I listen to the least. That's sort of my metric here. And these aren't the worst songs in the world. These are all Beatles songs, so they're all pretty darn good. But these are not my favorites. So what I'm going to do next, though, and I encourage you to stick around because this is where it gets really interesting. I have also a list of songs that people often will cite as the worst Beatles songs, or they show up on lists, or they've shown up in the comments here, and they're songs that I don't think are their worst songs. And so this is where I think the real controversial stuff comes in. So here we go. These are some of the songs people have mentioned in the comments too, and you'll see in here, and I can defend these. I'm not afraid to do that. Yesterday. So believe it or not, I have seen people say that Yesterday is one of the worst Beatles songs. Now that to me seems like almost sacrilegious. It's I think people who don't even know who the Beatles are know the song Yesterday. It's just one of those, just classic songs from the 60s that's been covered by probably 1,000 artists over the years. It's well known. Now, I thought more about it, though, when I saw people mentioning it, and I thought, I can understand why maybe people don't like it that much, though. It's not really a Beatles song. It's Paul McCartney's solo guitar. There's also some orchestration that George Martin recorded after it. It's really not, though, a full band Beatles song, and I don't think other Beatles had anything to do with the recording or writing of it. Paul originally wrote it as a song called Scrambled Eggs. It had like placeholder lyrics, and then he came up with the lyrics Yesterday, and these sort of sentimental lyrics after the fact. And, someone says it was released in 1965 and 1964. Oh, yeah, I screwed that up. Sorry, my mistake. It was released on Help. And now, interestingly enough, though, the band wasn't really happy about releasing it on Help. They felt that the song was basically a Paul McCartney solo song, and they were worried that this would kind of make them seem like they were going in this soft acoustic direction that Paul wanted, I guess, or Paul was for that song at least. And they actually were on the fence about releasing it at all, or at least on the album. But it ended up getting on there, and I actually think it feels completely out of place on Help. I love Help as an album, but Help is like a high energy album. And then like the second to last song is Yesterday, which is like this like just down tempo kind of sad, acoustic guitar ballad. Like it's just a weird out of place addition to Help. So I can see why people take issue with it. I mean, I love the song. I don't think it's on the worst list. I think it's a great song. But I can see why some people feel like it's just not great. The movie Yesterday sucked. Yes, I agree. That was definitely a terrible movie. And took a very interesting premise about the Beatles and just kind of ruined it, which is a shame. Let's see. Now moving on to some other ones here. You Know My Name, Look Up the Number. Now, people who aren't like super Beatles fans might not even recognize this song. I mean, it's a very obscure song. It's one that the group themselves clearly didn't feel they were going to release until the very end. They recorded it in 1967 around the Sgt. Pepper sessions, but they didn't release it until 1970. It was released as the B-side, actually, to Let It Be, the song Let It Be, if you can believe it. And it's a really, I don't think it's a terrible song. I think it's a really interesting song. It's broken up into like 4 or 5 parts. I would say if you've never heard it, listen to it. Try to listen to it now. It's broken up into like 4 or 5 parts. It's experimental. It's definitely not like a song. It's closer to like a not quite a Revolution 9, but it's in that direction. And, it's kind of weird. It wasn't one that I would listen to all the time, but I actually think that it's a very interesting mix of elements. It also has some really cool quirks on it, like apparently Brian Jones from the Rolling Stones played saxophone apparently toward the end of it. So like, there's some cool things about it that are just unexpected, and there's some cool effects on there. They're clearly having fun. It's a really just fun song to listen to, and so for that reason, I like it. I don't think it's a worse song, but there are people who are just like, this is just should have never been released. And it almost wasn't. The reason that it was released was that John Lennon was going to put it as a single for Plastic Ono Band, which was his project with Yoko Ono. And the band vetoed that and said, you can't put out anything that was a Beatles song on a Yoko Ono album. So they agreed to release it as the B-side to Let It Be. But there you go. All right. Now I'm going to get into some other White Album songs. I mentioned like White Album, it's controversial. A lot of people hate the stuff on the White Album. And they think it's like just should have never been released, some of these songs. I disagree. I think these are actually interesting, innovative songs, but a lot of people do not like them. So Obla Di Obla Da. It's the Beatles' closest attempt to like a reggae sound. I appreciate what Paul's trying to do with it. It's kind of fun. It's catchy. So I don't hate it, but some people really do. They find it really irritating. They think it's like a kid's song. But I think it's more nuanced than that. I think there's a quality to it that is actually worth listening. So a lot of people are saying it's unacceptable. I don't like this song. Again, it's not my favorite song. Let's be honest, not my favorite. But I also don't think it's a horrible song. So moving on though, Revolution 9. This is probably the one that's come up in the comments the most, the live chat comments. And Revolution 9, you have to accept for what it is. Like it's a pastiche. It's a not a pastiche. It's a collage. That's the word I'm looking for. It's not a song. It's John's attempt to be truly experimental and try something that like no other pop bands were really doing at that time. And I think that it actually kind of works. There are times that I will listen through all of Revolution 9 because it is really interesting to try to pick out the pieces that are layered inside of there. It has a lot of the stuff of the Beatles and people who are friends of the Beatles talking, and you don't get that on other Beatles songs. It's just these interesting elements. There are some actual musical interludes in it that I think are haunting, and I credit John for trying something like that. I can see why the band didn't really want to put it on the album, but they had the space. It wasn't like they had to add an extra side for it. I don't listen to it every time, but I don't think it's a terrible song. I think that people are wrong when they say that, it's awful. It's not. It is what it is. It's an experimental song, and I think it works as that. And it's weird. Like, what other song inspired so much? Like just I'm trying to word the word I'm looking for here, but I mean, it's a song that everybody kind of knows about, right? Maybe because you've played it backwards, or like number nine. That's sort of in your head. Like, it's a song that has an impact. It's not a forgettable song, and I think that we have to give him some credit for making something that's not only experimental but catchy in a weird way, right? So I like it. Anyway, we're still on White Album, by the way. All these are White Album, these three, and there's more. Piggies. A lot of people just absolutely hate this song, and I don't understand why. Piggies is a great song. George Harrison, was writing some really fantastic stuff at this period. His stuff on the White Album is as good as anything Paul or John was writing at the time. While My Guitar Gently Weeps. Why am I blanking on the other one? Oh, geez. Cry, not Cry Baby Cry, what's the other one? Long, Long, Long. I mean, he wrote some really, really great songs, and I think Piggies is no exception. I think Piggies is clever. I think the instrumentation on it is clever. I like the sort of imagery he's come up with in the song. It's a little weird, but it's not too weird. I love the sped up solo interlude, which I think is on the keyboard, right, or something like an organ or something. I think it's a cool song. It's fun to listen to. I enjoy it. I get why some people hate it. They say it's weird, but it's an amazing. Some people are agreeing here. It's an amazing song. I love Piggies. Yeah. So okay. So clearly, this is good to know. Some people don't like it, but there are people who defend it, and I'm in the camp who would defend this song. Bungalow Bill, and that's actually not the full title, but it's like so long. It's like the continuing story of Bungalow Bill, but you know what I'm talking about. This one, I mean, I'm not gonna lie, it's not my favorite song on the White Album. And there's parts of it that are kind of irritating. Like Yoko's harmony part is a little bit irritating to me, but it's kind of a catchy song, not gonna lie. And I love like the mellotron used in the intro. That like guitar, the flamenco guitar thing is actually a mellotron key that John's playing. And there's some like energy to it that's kind of cool, like the way that they're all kind of clapping and singing along. It sort of feels like you're just hanging out in the studio with them. So I don't think it's a terrible song. At least not as bad as some people say. Some people say it's a fun sing along. Yeah, I agree. Bungalow Bill's amazing. So see, some people are, we're kind of all over the page on this one. Another one that I almost stuck in here was Rocky Raccoon, and I actually forgot to put it on. Same thing with Rocky Raccoon. I think a lot of people just despise that song, and I don't think so. I think it's kind of a fun sort of sing along, I guess, in a way. Why don't we do it in the road? This is another one that's short and to the point, to say the least. And again, I enjoy it. I think it's just a really enjoyable song, and it goes on for about as long as it needs to, which is key. I think had this been like a 4-minute song, this would be irritating. But the performance is really strong. I love the sound. The sound of the piano on this one is awesome. The bass guitar on this is just really, it has that sort of low end oomph that you would expect from a song called "Why Don't We Do It in the Road." And it's also just like, I mean, for the time, even it sort of pushes the boundaries for what the Beatles were doing lyrically. I mean, a few years ago they would be "I Want to Hold Your Hand" was about as far as they would go, and now it's like, "Why don't we do it in the road? No one's watching us." Like that's, there's something about it that I think is interesting, at least. I mean, today that's like nothing, but at the time that's pushing some kind of pop boundary, I guess. So I like it. I think it's a really good song to listen to and to play like really loud. I just really enjoy this one, but some people hate it, so it's controversial. What else we got? What's the new Mary Jane? Well, this one, the reason it's not on my worst list, even though I do think it is one of their worst songs, is because they didn't release it. And I think it's unfair to say that they have a worse song if it's something they didn't put out or didn't feel comfortable putting out. This was the song that came out of their the sessions after India, which you might know, the Escher demos. And it's just this experimental song that John wrote with Yoko. It starts off like sort of normal and okay, but then it just ascends into just total noise and chaos and doesn't make any sense. And I'm glad they left it off the White Album. It was part of the same sessions, and the band kind of vetoed it. And so, there's, I don't know. I just think it's not surprising that this didn't make it onto anything. The only time it was released officially was in 1996. It was on the Anthology series, which was that like retrospective of all the Beatles stuff that didn't make it onto the records, like the stuff in the archives. So the band didn't release it. So it's hard for me to say that it's like one of their worst songs if it wasn't really a song that was out, published. But I do not like it. I think it is a terrible, terrible song. And there's even a good idea in it, but I think it's just executed so poorly. So, moving on though, that's enough of the White Album. Talked about it enough. I think it's a great album. There's not that much wrong with it. A lot of people though have really strong feelings about Maxwell's Silver Hammer, which is on Abbey Road, the last album. And I mean, I don't mind it. I really think it's a catchy, fun song. It's not, it's not poorly written. It's one of Paul's. Clearly, it has that Paul sensibility. But like, what other song has like an anvil in it? Like that's cool in itself. And the band's, or at least Paul, is having fun in it. It's a fun song. I like listening to it. It's not super long. It's at the right length. And it comes early on in Abbey Road, so I can kind of get through it, and there's no problem. So you may hate this song. It seems like people say they love it. It isn't even bad. Well, people honestly have very strong feelings about this song, and it was one of the ones that was cited in the comments on the poll as being one of the ones people don't like. So Yeah, it's about murder. Like that's kind of cool. How many pop songs are just about murder and getting off in a courtroom? So it was cool. I don't hate it. On the same album, on the same side of the same album, Octopus's Garden. Now, as a lot of you thought that maybe because I'm like, they think I'm like hating on Ringo. There's a lot of comments about how I'm, being really unfair, Ringo. But I do not put Octopus's Garden on my worst songs list. I think it's probably Ringo's best or one of his best performances. Um, I think he partnered up to write it when he came back from. He had quit the Beatles temporarily. Most people don't even know that he quit the Beatles. He was the first one to quit during the White Album sessions. He was like fed up with the band fighting, so he quit and like spent a few days on a yacht in the Mediterranean. And I think he came up with the idea for this song, Octopus's Garden, and then they recorded it as the band. Um, like I don't know, a year later, within a year. And I think it's like a catchy song. It's clever, and the underwater effects of them singing with like sounding like they're underwater. It's fun. Like I have no problem with it. Um, and I'm sure kids love it. But it's also not just a kids song. So I think it's one of Ringo's best efforts in the group. And I can't put on a worst song. I also think that there's nothing wrong with Abbey Road. Abbey Road is a close to perfect album. And so, I see people agreeing this is definitely his best song. Kate McDonald, yeah, I agree. It's not that bad. No, it's not. It's not. I love Octopus's Garden. It's the best. What's the best Beatles song? I think that's a stretch, but um, it's hard to pronounce the plural Octopus's Garden. Yeah, it is kind of hard. That's true. So yeah, I think it's not quite. Somebody says it's garbage. I don't think it's quite garbage. I think it's pretty good. Not my favorite, but not terrible either. Anyway, I think that's it. So there we go. Like that's my list. I'm going to run a poll after this. I'm curious what people think of their worst song. I hope you enjoyed this broadcast. Let me see if I can go back and show you again my list in case you've forgotten. But again, I picked these songs because I think that these are the ones that I probably listen to the least and care for the least. It does not mean that I hate these songs. It does not mean I think that the Beatles were writing terrible songs. I think that all of them are quite good. But this stuff is definitely the B tier. And I'm curious what people think. I'm going to look through the comments and see what other things I left off of here that weren't on either list. The worst is Hey Jude. Totally disagree. Why Don't We Do It in the Road is a good song? Yes. A lot of people hate Birthday. A lot of people do hate Birthday. And I didn't know that until recently. I just figured it's like a pretty decent song. And it's sort of weird that the Beatles wrote a birthday song, but it's catchy. It's better than the actual birthday song, so there's that going for it. And let's see what else. Any other interesting comments here? The German songs. Well, yeah, you can't count the German songs. Come on, they had to do those. That was like a contractual thing probably to get the albums released in Germany. And they're actually not that bad. I mean, they're singing in German. They're good songs. Your Blues is great. What are you talking about? Come on. Wild Honey Pie, yes, that's on my list. Maggie May and Dig It, I almost included these on my controversial list, but I didn't because I don't think that's fair to include like a snippet of a song and evaluate it as such. Dig It, I think, is enjoyable. It's like just this quick interlude. Same with Maggie May. So I didn't put those on because I don't think they're full songs. Me and Mr. Mustard, not good. All right, that's just ridiculous. Anyway, well, I think this has run its course. I think we've done a pretty good job of going through most of these. I really appreciate the comments on this. I knew this would be sort of a tough one to get into, but I'm hoping to do another one, and I'll do another poll to see what you want me to cover next. These are a lot of fun. And again, before I go, I want you to remind everybody, if you have a chance, and if you can, please consider contributing to the COVID-19 Music Relief by Spotify. They're doing a great job raising money for artists and matching up to $10 million of contributions. Check it out, covid19musicrelief.byspotify.com. And of course, subscribe to my channel if you aren't already subscribed. I haven't done a ton of videos in my typical style lately, but I have some in the works. If you have ideas, let me know. But these lives are fun and a chance to kind of try some different formats out with people, and I love hearing from you as well. Please keep the comments coming even after the video gets posted. And yeah, I mean, I didn't know how worst Beatles songs would go, but This is an interesting thought experiment, and I'm going to do it again. So tune in next time and keep listening to good music. Thanks for checking it out. All right.